Welcome back, gang. In this tutorial, I'll discuss a common way to achieve coherence in our writing. I call it passing the baton. Before I begin, let me say something about the words cohesion and coherence. Some writing textbooks make a distinction between them, but most textbooks don't, and I find that trying to do so leaves a lot of students confused. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'll consistently use the word coherence. I'll use the phrase passing the baton to refer to the particular strategy that this tutorial is about. If you prefer to call it cohesion, you're welcome to do so. Okay, let's visualize the strategy. Here we see two runners in a relay race. The first runner, to the left of the video, is completing her part of the race. The second runner, to the right, is just beginning her part. Because it's a relay race, the first runner has to pass the baton to the second. You can see it in her left hand. The second runner reaches behind her to receive the baton. At the crucial moment, the baton links the two runners. Keep this moment in mind. To illustrate how this strategy applies to writing, I'll examine several examples from the book How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker, a psycholinguist at Harvard University. The book is not a piece of original research, but it is written for an educated audience. In our first example, Pinker demonstrates the strategy like a champion. The psychologist Paul Rosen has masterfully captured the psychology of disgust. Disgust is a fear of incorporating an offending substance into one's body. The passage consists of two sentences. A reader can easily see that the second sentence continues the idea begun in the first. That's because the first one ends with the word disgust, and the second begins with the word disgust. Think of the sentences as two runners in a relay race. The word disgust is like the baton that the first runner passes to the second. First it's here, now it's here. It links the two sentences, helping the reader to see the relationship between them. It creates coherence. The strategy is really that simple. End a sentence with a word, begin the next sentence with the same word, or perhaps a very closely related synonym. Pinker tends to repeat the same word. To understand the power of this strategy, let's consider an example that doesn't use it. Plants blend into a sea of green and often can be identified only by their flowers. The site of future fruit, nuts, or tubers is marked by the harbingers of growth, flowers, for creatures smart enough to remember them. If you're like most readers, you felt a moment of confusion there. You reached the end of the first sentence, and your mind naturally understood that flowers was a new idea, something that the writer wanted to emphasize, so you were expecting that the next few words would continue that topic. Instead of that, you found new topics: fruit, nuts, tubers, harbingers of growth. Of course, there is a connection between the ideas, but the reader's mind has to work for it a little harder than it wants to, and some readers might not perceive the connection at all. The sentence doesn't confirm the connection until it repeats flowers here, 16 words after the beginning of the sentence. Psychologically, 16 words is a pretty long gap. Fortunately, this is not the passage that Pinker actually wrote. Here's the original. Plants blend into a sea of green and often can be identified only by their flowers. Flowers are harbingers of growth, marking the site of future fruit, nuts, or tubers for creatures smart enough to remember them. The first sentence ends with the word flowers, and the second sentence begins with the word flowers. Passing the baton like this links the two sentences much more clearly. It establishes the relationship between flowers and fruits, nuts, and tubers. Now, don't worry about repetition when you pass the baton. For one thing, keyword repetition is the most basic tool for achieving coherence. If you have doubts about that, please watch my tutorial about it. Second, the strategy is flexible. As long as the repeated term, the one I'm calling the baton, occurs near the beginning of the second sentence, it will still do its job. Here's an example of that. Natural selection is not the only cause of evolutionary change. Organisms also change over the eons because of statistical accidents. As you can see, the baton here is the word change. It is the last word of the first sentence, but it's the third word, not the first, of the second sentence. I think you'll agree that the slight delay doesn't make the passage less coherent. Figuratively, readers can still hear the first iteration of the word change when they come to the second. Of course, you must use good judgment when inserting gaps like this. The farther away the repetition gets from the end of the first sentence, the less effective it becomes. For our final example, let's consider the way the passive voice can be used to help us pass the baton. Remember that an important effect of the passive voice is that an idea that would have been the object of a clause becomes the subject of the clause, pushing it to the left side of the sentence, closer to the end of the previous sentence. Pinker uses that placement to his advantage here. A famous example of inference rules comes from the psychologist Peter Wason. Wason was inspired by the philosopher Karl Popper's ideal of scientific reasoning. A hypothesis is accepted if attempts to falsify it fail. In this passage, the baton that passes between the two sentences is the name Wason. In order to make that work, the passage uses the passive form of the verb inspire. If it used the active voice, the sentence would begin with a reference to the philosopher Karl Popper, and that would spoil the coherence. Using the passive voice lets the sentence begin with Wason, closing the gap. Passing the baton is one strategy among many that we can use to make our writing coherent. Like any other strategy, it's best used in moderation. Steven Pinker uses it more often than most writers, I think, but that still amounts to only once or twice on an average page. Thanks for watching. Say what you mean.